I feel the need to share an inspirational quote with you all. When you set a goal, you are committed to can I, constant and never ending improvement. You've acknowledged the need that all human beings have for constant, never ending self improvement. Man, I would say universal human needs are more like food, water, shelter, and then if we're lucky, education, healthcare, love expressed through relationships with others, autonomy, maybe democracy. So these are the kind of things that I think about when I think about the things that all human beings need, rather than constant, never-ending self-improvement. Also, I think we need to point out the contradiction here because you're always told to love yourself, and at the same time, you're supposed to engage in constant, never-ending self-improvement. And finally, I would just like to object to this never-ending self-improvement. I was kind of hoping that when I died, I might be able to take a rest from this. I didn't realize that the wellness program and the self-optimization regime would continue and even after I'm dead. Okay, so all joking aside, this motivational or inspirational quotation helps us to introduce the first topic that I would like to talk about in this final video lecture, which is psychopolitics. So in 2017, Korean writer Byung-Chul Han published a seminal book called Psychopolitics, in which he offered a devastating critique of contemporary capitalism, in which human subjects under neoliberal capitalism have voluntarily turned their own lives into ongoing projects of self-optimization and achievement, or can I? Han argues that our society is obsessed with personal achievement, and that this obsessive focus results in us blaming ourselves for our personal failures rather than blaming the social structures that create conditions of inequality, suffering, and exploitation, all of which means that we never look to resist the system that causes all the suffering for us. In Han's account, modern people have become entrepreneurs of their own lives without ever truly understanding that freedom only ever meaningfully exists through community and friendship. The neoliberal mutation of capitalism, so that's from the late 70s, arguably up until the very, very recent past, or even this time now, neoliberal capitalism has turned us all into entrepreneurs of the self, Han says, with each one of us waging our own inner struggle against ourselves. So instead of being a community, the living condition of the entrepreneurial self is a solitude, a loneliness, in which we all exploit ourselves by aiming for constant, never-ending self-improvement. For Han, all of this amounts to nothing more than a ruse of individual freedom. So it's not real freedom at all. According to Han, this process marks a new stage in the development of what French theorist Michel Foucault called the disciplinary society. This disciplinary society began in the 17th century and focused on controlling and disciplining the operations of human bodies in locations like prisons, schools, and factories, thereby socializing the body and its productive capacities and bringing them under the control of the state or private business. However, in neoliberal societies, disciplinary power has shifted away from the body towards the psyche. So that's the mind or the inner resources, in a process that Byung-Chul Han calls psychopolitics. Han remarks that, quote, now productivity is not to be enhanced by overcoming physical resistance so much as by optimizing psychic or mental processes. So they've already taken control of the body, Foucault argued. Byung-Chul Han is saying now they're trying to control your mind as well. So Han contends this is being achieved through the deployment of digital technology on a massive scale. Although Foucault's later work did begin to focus on, and a quotation from Foucault, the technologies of individual domination, the history of how an individual acts upon him or herself, Han claims that Foucault did not recognize the drive of neoliberalism towards perpetual self-optimization, or can I, as the most representative and efficient mode of domination and exploitation. So this whole psychology is produced by the economic system, and it's a way of exploiting us for greater profit. What is more, while actually a slave, the entrepreneur of the self undertakes all of this self-optimization willingly and even enthusiastically, and under the illusion that they are actually free. As Han remarks, neoliberalism, quote, ensures that people act on themselves so that power relations become interiorized and then interpreted as freedom. Self-optimization and submission, freedom and exploitation fall into one. So we have internalized this social discourse that we need to optimize our own productivity. We believe that we are choosing to do this freely. Actually, it's something closer to a social obligation that we have to do in order to succeed in the workplace and in the education system when we are confronted with increasingly stressful lives. Han suggests that perhaps the biggest danger in all of this is that the neoliberal system is bringing into existence an age of burnout and exhaustion. Because the human psyche is now being exploited as well, psychological problems such as burnout and depression are reaching epidemic proportions. So it's a simple explanation. Foucault said that the state especially wanted to control our bodies. And now, of course, we're moving towards a system which is more controlled by private businesses and corporations. By this time, the body is already long under control in the workplace. Now they need to exploit the psychic or inner resources as well to maximize the profit of the corporation. And this is why you get things like mindfulness programs and wellness programs at work. So where can we see examples of this trend towards self-optimization? Han suggests that we see it in the trend for self-help literature, motivational retreats, self-management workshops, and in mental training like mindfulness that promises self-optimization and efficiency. The body is increasingly kitted out in wearable tech and sensors that automatically register data, log our heart rates, our calorie intakes, and the number of steps that we have walked in an increasingly quantified self. So I'm sure you know somebody who's doing the 10,000 steps every day. If you don't, you will meet this person very soon, I'm sure. My mother does it, for example. Other lives have been reduced to millions of data points within a regime of self-surveillance, self-tracking, and dataism, which is devoid of any meaningful narrative, ethical standard, or notion of the truth. We are encouraged to share our data freely through social media, and then our communicative statements are mined for information about our emotional states and mood. And this functions as a giant psychograph, which can be exploited through emotional capitalism and emotional design. So the psychograph refers to like the psychological health of the entire population. So we voluntarily put all of this information online through social media, and including these data points about our lives. And this is used to monitor us and to understand us better, and then to sell things back to us through emotional capitalism and emotional design. Although Han does not mention this himself in his book Psychopolitics, in discussing this practice of self-optimization, it is worth remarking upon the fact that the bedrock of virtue ethics, so that's Aristotelianism, virtue ethics, has been stripped away from the Aristotelian framework of eudaimonia in a way that is remarkably similar to the way in which modern mindfulness focuses as a productivity driver without the ethical content of Buddhism. So this was kind of my conclusion in doing all of this research before the course. In the Eastern context, we started with Buddhism, and then we looked at Google, and we can see by this point, mindfulness has no ethical content. It has no communal aspect. And then in the Western side of the discourse, it started with Aristotle, you may remember in the first lecture, and the idea of human flourishing or eudaimonia. And this was a deeply ethical project as well. It was rooted in ethics, just like the Buddhist system. But in both cases, these two originary thinkers, foundational thinkers, both of whom were highly concerned with ethics, this ethical content has been completely removed from the whole discussion. So now we just optimize ourselves and our performance. This is the modern diluted version of Aristotelianism and Buddhism both. Okay, so let's move on and let's change the topic slightly and look at some critiques of American wellness practices, because of course a lot of this is coming from America. So one book that we're going to talk about now is Ruth Whippman's 2019 book called America the Anxious. And she asked the question, does striving for happiness actually make us happier, or does it make us more unhappy? So she questions the American obsession with happiness and asks whether it might be counterproductive. So upon moving from her home in the UK to the US, she was struck by the frequency with which people, including strangers, brought up the topic of happiness during conversation. This suggested that there might be a cultural anxiety around the topic, which itself produces unhappiness. Whippman draws attention to a problematic paradox, which also lies at the heart of positive psychology. The more people strive to become happy, the more anxious they can become about their perceived failure to meet social expectations of happiness. This creates a cycle of dissatisfaction that is both self-imposed and culturally reinforced. Whippman points out that the US scores comparatively poorly in international happiness indexes and comparatively high on anxiety. She is also skeptical about some of the scientific claims of positive psychology, as she points out that much of the research suffers from methodological flaws. Whippman's critique also extends to the funding of the positive psychology movement. Positive psychology has received significant funding from private and public institutions, and Whippman argues that these relationships create conflicts of interest that influence the direction and outcome of research, which often prioritizes marketable outcomes over genuine mental health solutions. One example of this is the John Templeton Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization known for funding research at the intersection of science, religion, and human flourishing, which has been a significant supporter of positive psychology research. Whippman points out that the John Templeton Foundation has funded a considerable amount of research in positive psychology, which raises questions about the potential biases of the research and the ways that it seems to align with the foundation's broader goals. This relationship, according to Whippman, may contribute to a narrowing of the discourse around mental health and well-being, focusing on individualistic solutions rather than addressing social problems that affect happiness overall. So the point here is that John Templeton was basically a stock market investor. He set up a philanthropic organization, which means he didn't believe that his money should be paid in taxes to the government. He preferred to influence society through alternative means. So he funded a lot of this positive psychology research because it puts the emphasis on individual responses to the problem of stress or psychological suffering or unhappiness. This means that we don't need to look at social causes of the problem, and we don't need to pay more taxes to the government. So in fact, it fits in very nicely with the neoliberal psychology that we've been talking about. Part of that psychology is offloading the responsibility for social problems onto the individual. Another part of that psychology, of course, is to distrust big government. And then in order to pay lower taxes, we don't want to talk about the fact that maybe social support systems, welfare systems, healthcare, affordable healthcare in hospitals, housing, freely available housing, these things might actually contribute in some way to well-being. So instead, we ignore all of these problems and we only fund research that looks at the individual's responsibility for their own happiness. So the claim that the John Templeton Foundation prioritizes scientific research is also contradicted by the fact that it has funded climate change denial or climate skepticism. In particular, critics have pointed to John Templeton funding for projects that are known for questioning the consensus on human-driven climate change, despite overwhelming scientific consensus on the issues. The Foundation's grants in these areas have sometimes been seen as supporting a broader ideological and political agenda rather than focusing purely on scientific inquiry. Some critics have noted that certain projects funded by the John Templeton Foundation, especially those supporting free market economics, may align with neoliberal ideas, including skepticism towards government intervention in the economy, which reinforces the lack of emphasis that positive psychology places on the social conditions that produce human suffering. In this understanding, concepts such as grit and resilience, so these are the names of two very well-known books in positive psychology that have been popularized by positive psychology, align with a social Darwinist framework and austerity politics. Is it possible that John Templeton grants are more likely to be given to positive psychology researchers who do not contradict the political orientations of the Foundation's owners? So the point here is that a lot of positive psychology fits in very nicely with this ideology of neoliberalism, in which the individual is responsible for their own suffering. So it's this idea that they remove the support from the state to any type of program that might benefit poor people, might benefit disabled people, any kind of affordable healthcare, affordable housing. These things are increasingly ignored. All of the responsibility is put onto the individual for their own success and failure. So this is the viewpoint of the founder of this foundation, the John Templeton Foundation. It's free market economics, it's neoliberalism, and therefore it promotes the agenda that we've been talking about in these videos. So let's look at Martin Seligman. Of course, he's one of these positive psychology researchers. So one consequence of Seligman's research is that supposedly we are all capable of influencing our own happiness through practices such as learned optimism. One consequence of this, according to Will Davies, is that in the workplace, happiness is increasingly seen as a choice. He cites numerous business gurus who claim that workers can now either choose to be happy and successful or choose to be unhappy and suffer the consequences. So this is rather like the argument that was made by Sean Achor. Numerous writers in the positive psychology and mindfulness spaces regurgitate the platitude, so they repeat the empty idea that happiness is like a muscle which needs exercising regularly in order to keep it in full working order. Lurking within this agenda is the opportunity to blame people for their own failure and lack of success in optimizing their own happiness. In a similar vein, New York Times business reporter David Gellis makes a bold claim, quote, "Stress isn't something imposed on us, it's something we impose on ourselves." But we should ask if this is really true. a meta-analysis of 228 studies by researchers at Stanford Graduate School of Business found that the top 10 stressors derived from factors such as poor management practices, overly demanding corporate cultures, lack of adequate healthcare coverage, job insecurity, lack of autonomy, long working hours, unrealistic demands, and low levels of organizational justice. With insecurity towards your job insecurity, so not knowing whether you're going to have a job or not in the near future, accounting for 50% of the poor mental health. In this context, Davies reminds us that Gallup, so this is a polling organization, Gallup's frequent and wide-ranging studies into worker disengagement have found that only 13% of the global workforce is properly engaged. It's a shocking statistic. Only 13% of workers are mentally engaged, while around 20% of employees in North America and Europe are actively disengaged. Davies argues that disengagement manifests itself in absenteeism, so people don't go to work, sickness, and presenteeism, in which employees come into the office merely to be physically present. So they don't want to work, they just want to be there and pick up the paycheck. This costs the US economy as much as $550 billion a year. Davies asks whether an opportunity for reforming the system exists within this epidemic of business anxiety, chronic alienation, and burnout among the workers it depends on. In other words, isn't it time to start reforming the workplace rather than trying to extract ever more productivity from the employee? So let's wrap up the conclusion to this video and the previous video. So the critical perspectives presented in this lecture highlight the commodification of religious traditions as spirituality and the way that modern mindfulness, the well-being industry, and positive psychology are all broadly in alignment with neoliberal capitalist values and their use of these practices as tools of social control. While these practices do offer temporary relief and stress management on an individual level, they often fail to address or challenge the social structures and systemic issues that contribute to widespread mental health challenges and social alienation. By engaging with these perspectives, we gain a deeper understanding of how mindfulness and well-being industries might reinforce existing power structures rather than promote meaningful change. It's often branded as being revolutionary, but in fact, it's complicit with the system and doesn't lead to any change. This calls for a reevaluation of how these practices are implemented, marketed, and understood, and whether a more ethical, collective approach is possible. Ultimately, any approach to mindfulness or well-being must question its own assumptions and actively resist complicity in systems that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. Okay, so that's the final thought there. So we're existing in this society where we're continually asked to optimize our productivity, to self-optimize, in the words of Byung-Chul Han, to focus on our growth. But this is actually, in some ways, merely a system of control of the individual at a social level. So maybe we need to start questioning this entire discourse. And maybe, in fact, the problem is the system itself. So this is the thing that is excluded from all of these practices in the workplace. So in the workplace, people don't ask whether it's the workplace that's causing the stress. The responsibility is offloaded onto the individual to deal with their own stress or to be happy in the workplace. So on a social level, also, we're encouraged to deal with our stress individually rather than collectively. But actually, maybe it's the system as a whole, through its emphasis on this constant and never-ending self-improvement, that is driving all of the stress. So here, I think the Buddhist point of view would be something like just slow your life down a little bit. You don't always need to optimize yourself. You don't always need to rush. You don't always need to conform with the prevailing view in society. And sometimes it's fine just to relax, just to slow down, to smell the coffee, as we say, to look at the flowers in the garden, or simply just to enjoy your life a little bit more, to rest and relax without this constant need for self-improvement, which often doesn't benefit you as much as it benefits others. So we might conclude with a little bit of Korean to finish this off. Sorry for my terrible pronunciation, but there is some wisdom in this, I think. 조금 느려도 괜찮아. Okay, thanks everybody. That's the end of my video on the neoliberal capitalist economy and practices of well-being and how those two things interrelate. Okay, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to hearing your discussions in the class.